I would like to welcome on David Chandler next. David is a member as well of the board of directors of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. He was a physics teacher and math teacher, and he has played a critical role in the evolution of our understanding about the events of 9/11, specifically his analysis of the events at the World Trade Center, the free fall collapse of World Trade Center Building 7, and many other critical observations regarding the destruction of the Twin Towers. And so his contribution has been seminal and critical. And David has also taken a huge interest in the COVID-19 event, has followed the reporting on that and the alternative media very closely, and has also, followed the work of Madhava Setty and Dr. Meryl Nass, who are going to speak next, and really, really deeply appreciates their work. And David wanted the opportunity to sort of introduce them and interface with them in this event. And so, David, would love to hand it over to you, and looking forward to your remarks.
Okay, thank you. I'll be introducing Madhava Setty and Meryl Nass in just a few minutes. In some dialogue I had with Madhava on social media in a Q&A after one of his articles, he asked me the question of what motivated me to get involved with 9/11 research. And this actually, I think, relates to some of what he wants to talk about. So as a reference point, let me share a little bit about how this all began for me. Whenever I'm asked how I got started with my 9/11 research, I say it started in the 1980s. I was working with a church in Southern California that was sheltering refugees from Central America as part of the sanctuary movement. The US was backing dictatorships in El Salvador and Guatemala that were murdering their own people in large numbers. They were sponsoring death squads, bombing whole villages from helicopters. One of the refugees we were supporting, named David, described being on the receiving end of one of the bombings. He kept saying, "It's terrible, it's terrible." And it was very moving. The US also sponsored the Nicaraguan Contras. These were the former National Guard troops that had served the ousted Somoza dictatorship. And the CIA trained them in Honduras to make cross-border terrorist raids into Nicaragua, where they attacked villages, destroyed crops, and mined the roads. The US press was blatantly and systematic lying about it all. I knew they were lying because I had a direct line of communication with aid workers on the ground and heard the stories of the refugees themselves. The stories in the press were just that, stories, complete fabrications. This knowledge allowed me to calibrate the press. I never took them at face value again. On the surface, this may not seem to have anything to do with 9/11, but that experience destroyed my sense of American exceptionalism. I was an Eagle Scout. I grew up thinking America was virtuous. I discovered we were not being who we claimed we were. This experience was disillusioning and painful. The morning of 9/11 2001 was colored by my earlier experiences. I immediately sensed that the chickens had come home to roost. I've since learned that was a quote from Malcolm X, I believe. Anyway, being aware of our record of horrendous violence, out of sight, out of mind, I was not surprised that all of the violence would blow back on us. When it became apparent to me a few years later, based on hard evidence, that 9/11 was an intentionally self-inflicted wound, I lost my place. There was no barrier in my mind to keep me from following the evidence that led to that conclusion. In my case, it was this preconditioning that plowed the ground for me. Other people had their wake-up calls with the assassination of JFK, RFK, MLK, or Malcolm X. For others, it was the Vietnam War. I recently read someone who said her wake-up call was reading Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Some people, no doubt, opened their eyes cold turkey, despite the barrage of propaganda following 9/11. These preconditioning experiences have the potential to open our eyes. 9/11 and then the COVID crisis and its response are bigger than the labels on those events. It's bigger than the labels would indicate. Peter Dale Scott calls these structural deep events, which he defines as deep events large enough to affect the whole fabric of society. Whether it is the assassination of a key individual, murder of dozens or hundreds of witnesses, the spectacular murder of a few thousand people as a pretext for war, or the hidden murders of hundreds of thousands or even millions of people as victims of biowarfare agents. Once you have understood the willingness of US government elites to perpetrate such crimes, the idea that they could never do this evaporates. Enlightenment in the case of one such event opens the door of plausibility in future events. Plausibility still needs verification, but there's plausibility as a step. As Niels Harrit mentioned a few minutes ago, truth is a one-way street. I found a niche in the 9/11 truth movement because my physics background gave me eyes to see some aspects of the events in a useful way. There was a natural fit. However, eventually I immersed myself in the medical freedom movement as well. I'm not an expert in medicine, but I understand scientific experimentation. I can analyze data, also apply logic, and recognize propaganda when I see it. Most importantly, I can follow a reasoned argument. I have common sense, and I have developed a sense of who I can trust. And these apply to people who may not have specific talents. Finding our way through all of this is ultimately a community endeavor. I first became aware of Madhava Setty through his writings and talks about all things COVID. He works with the Children's Health Defense, writes articles, and gives frequent talks and interviews. It was some time later that I was surprised to see references in his writings to the anomalous collapses of the Twin Towers and Building 7. In one amazing paper, he wrote about coming out to his MIT classmates about his views about 9/11. It was well after I was familiar with his work on COVID issues that I learned that he started out as an engineer with an engineering degree and only later switched to medicine. I'll let him speak for himself, but my impression is that 9/11 helped open his eyes and helped serve as a bridge to his COVID research. I think we both recognize that we're seeing 9/11 and COVID as two acts of the same play. Meryl Nass, another MIT alum, has a background that bridges a whole series of events. She waded into the swamp of calling it biowarfare, bioterrorism, and biocorruption in general from very early in her career. She was the first to prove that an anthrax epidemic in Africa was actually an instance of biowarfare. The white population that controlled the scene was using anthrax against the Black majority population. She witnessed the corruption and scams surrounding the treatment of Ebola, HIV/AIDS, Lyme disease, Gulf War syndrome, and the anthrax vaccine, which was administered widely through the military without adequate testing. Her involvement with the 9/11 came through her investigation of the anthrax letters that we should not forget were actually part of the overall 9/11 psyop. They were used to tie 9/11 to Iraq and Saddam Hussein and pave the way for the Patriot Act. After all of her work on the national and international stage, she was hounded out of her medical practice by a local medical licensing board in Maine because she advocated for hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin rather than going along with the irrational, contrary recommendations of the CDC and the FDA and the WHO. I watched the live stream episodes of the medical licensing board's kangaroo court that attacked her livelihood and found the atmosphere to be both comic in its incoherence and horrifying in its mindless vindictiveness. The International Center for 9/11 Justice is an outgrowth of the 9/11 Truth Movement, but as a group, we, and with this symposium in particular, we're looking beyond the specifics of one particular set of events to the destruction of democracy and the rolling coup d'etat that has been going on since the early 60s and continues to this day. For the purpose of bridging between the two structural deep events known as 9/11 and COVID, Madhava Setty and Meryl Nass are ideal guests to bring their perspectives on the larger picture.